All right, and welcome to another episode of Usapang Musiko Season 2. And for today's episode, we'll be talking about is the violin an expensive instrument, no? Based on not just on the value, but based on facts, really, no? How history told the story of stringed instruments. Okay, we'll not focus mainly on the violin, but maybe the string family as a whole. It's not the most expensive when it comes to the value because you get a lot of cheap instruments now. It's easily accessible, but expensive in owning it, you know. It's the same as with a car. There are some cars that are more expensive to own and maintain than other cars, no? The same with houses. The same with our bodies, diba? If you want to really have a healthy uh, lifestyle or healthy body, we have to take care of it. We have to maintain it properly. And it's the longevity of owning something that makes it expensive. And why is it expensive? We'll talk about that. First of all, if you're familiar, no, about there's a lot of marching bands here in the Philippines. No, there's like marching band in every corner of every province. You see a lot of bands being formed, but why aren't there a lot of orchestras being formed? And this really goes way back, and it's part of the reason why I would say bowed stringed instruments are expensive. Just the fact that there are more bands, marching bands, symphonic bands, you call it, whatever you need to call it, versus having string orchestras and orchestras in general, no, shows you the that maintaining these types of instruments are more expensive. And that's how history went, no? How bands grew and how orchestras are really hard to maintain. It's all because of the strings. So if you're not familiar with symphonic bands or wind uh, orchestras. They are technically the same as the full blown symphony orchestras, but without the strings. Okay. Other instruments fill in the strings. Like, for example, don't quote me on this, but like the violas are being played by saxophones, the violins are being played by clarinets, they are filling in for the strings parts. Why? Because strings are hard to maintain and are very expensive to own. No, not just talking about the high end ones. Even the cheap ones technically are more expensive. You have to lash out more money in order to maintain them than just wind instruments or brass instruments for that matter. Okay, why? It's all because it's made of wood and wood reacts to the harshness of the weather. So it's really hard. Even, transporting your instrument, your violin, for example, you're coming from the Philippines, you're gonna bring it somewhere cold, somewhere dry. You need a lot of care and attention because you might break your instrument. There are some instruments that break during shipping, for example, especially violins and cellos, they break because there's a lot of empty space in between and there are a lot of seams that can crack open, no? Versus, let's say, a clarinet is also made of wood, like, right? But it's more stable than the violin. How it's made is basically the difference, and how it's maintained actually. Of course, I went to university, and of course we've been talking to a lot of other musicians. No, I know a lot of woodwind players, brass players, percussion players, and they know what they need to maintain their instruments. Like for brass players, I think they only need a cloth and of course to wipe it down, and then valve oil, no, for some instruments with valves. And then basically that's what all don't quote me on this, but I think that's the basic necessity that they need is just to keep it clean and keep it well lubricated so that it works, no? And for woodwind players, I think they just need cork, no, just so that they can fix it. And of course, reeds are expensive as well, but maintaining reeds and maintaining strings, that's the thing that you need to consider as well. No, because if you're just gonna maintain your reeds and then maintain your instruments as easy as you can, not just by cleaning it up, it's not that hard. Because the thing is, you can disassemble a clarinet, you can disassemble a bassoon, no. But for a musician who plays the violin, can you disassemble your whole instrument and put it back together that it would still sound? No, that's the main difference. It doesn't work out that way unless you're skilled luthier who can really work on your instruments. Okay. Yeah. So I want to speak on based on the market values of maintenance costs of the instrument. And then you decide whether it really is expensive to maintain or own or not. No. First things first, strings. Okay. So strings degrade over time. I want you to hear my violin right now. This is my main violin. I'm gonna pluck all the strings. These strings, I think I changed them last April or May. So they're almost a year old. And look how it sounds. My E string is out of tune. But if I play on it, it's gonna be in tune. You know why? Uh, because I need to make my E string higher so that when I press down, it would sound the same. It's really, really hard to maintain. So for that, I need to change strings, right? How much the strings cost? So you can get as cheap as 100 pesos for cheap strings, no? And then you can go as high as like 6,000 pesos. So that's like $2 to around roughly around $120. That's a set na. So but for cellos, of course, that's like 12,000. That goes up in value. So it depends on the instrument, no. So violin, focusing on the violin, you can say it's not that bad, no? 100 pesos. But of course, if you're a professional, you want good sounding strings. So that's why you need to shell out a bit of cash. And if you are regularly performing, your strings will degrade much, much faster. So usually it takes around 3 to 4 months. So that adds up a lot of money. So let's say you're a performer. Um, you perform at least 10 months a year and to take 2 months off. No, that's like, I think that's the basic orchestra season. Don't quote me on that though. But yeah, if you play 10 months a year and then take breaks of 2 months off, let's say that in the span of 10 months, you'll go through 3 sets of strings. So that's if you're an average like me, I buy less than 3,000. Let's say 3,000 pesos. So it's easy. So that's like 9,000 pesos a year just for changing your strings. No? So it adds up, you know. And if you're a cellist, at least 9,000 pesos per set. So that's like 27,000 pesos per year of you playing your instrument. So that's just for strings. No. What are other maintenance costs? Bow. Okay, bow hair. Even if you buy the cheapest instrument, you'd still shell out a little bit more money than just having a set with you versus having a clarinet that you just buy a reed or having a flute, for example, that you don't actually buy anything except for, I don't know what they call that. It's like lubrication pa rin yun eh. I'm not really sure. And then maintenance for pads, but you don't do it as much maintenance as a violin, for example. No. So yeah, it adds up. So bow, I think the average price for rehairing your bow here in the Philippines is around 1,500 pesos. That's around $30. So you need to consider at least once a year of rehairing your bow. So you see it adds up, no? It's the cost of ownership. It's called that, no? And then setup. Of course, if you change strings often, the inner workings of your instrument will be moving quite often as well. So, I think setups usually around 600 to it could go over 3,000. So, 112 to 12 to 70, 60 dollars, something like that. Yeah. So you see, it will eventually add up, and it's the maintenance cost, not just owning it, that's quite expensive, especially if you're a professional. No, and that's why the value of the instrument is really really important. Even though it's cheap, you have to be ready for those costs, even for beginners. No, it might you might have a 2,000 peso violin, but your strings might break often, so you have to buy sets after sets after sets. Diba? That's a common problem I encounter with my students as well. No, strings occasionally break, not because you're not careful, but it just happens. So you have to buy more, and it adds up. If you really do the accounting on how it works, it's gonna add up so much at us very very low amount of time. Yeah. And then of course you have to consider nga weather. It really would change a lot, no? For example, if it's raining outside, I hate the weather if it's raining and I need to play. Why? I can't play properly, no? And you have to put more rosin. Oh, there's another thing. Rosin, basically a cake of rosin that would cost around 100 pesos to like 700 pesos. That's like $2 to $8, something like that. Or I know, 2 to 14, $15. It's like good for 1 year, technically. No? But not a lot of us would take note on that kasi you can still use it. No? You just need to take care of the rosin. But basically, it lasts a year before it dries out. So you have to do something with it. So you have to buy another one. You have to buy another one. And there's no shortcut with it or any hacks I could teach you to actually save money on it because it's gonna do more harm than good. Like for example, if your strings are already bad and you need to change it, you can't put on old strings. It sound worse. So you really have to buy. Unless you know how to make your own strings. And it's not that easy. No, and you can't use guitar strings. No, that won't work. Maybe sometimes. But yeah. And of course it really needs constant care and attention. So if you let's go back down. If you are managing an orchestra, the instruments that you lend to your players, what if someone gets sick and they can't play? So they give it back to you. So you have to maintain it. How do you maintain it? You have to clean it every day, wipe it down every day, check the temperature of where it is. No, check the humidity. There's a lot of things going on. It's hard to work with wood because technically wood is alive. Even though it's varnished, it still contracts and expands, and you can feel that. No? Sometimes when I hold my instrument, when it's a rainy day, it's quite, I don't know, not really heavy, but it seems bulky, no? Especially my bows as well. You can feel it on your bow. Sometimes it wants to tighten more if it's cold. If it's so warm, it wants to loosen up. So those are really things you need to consider. And why I'm saying that the violin is an expensive instrument if you want to get into it. And as the size goes up, the expenses goes up as well. So if you're playing a violin, it's like the cheapest one of the bunch. Then if you play a viola, it's gonna be more expensive, maybe 1.5 times more expensive than if you go to a cello, it's like twice as much. And a bass, I think, is 2.5 times more expensive than maintaining your violin. No. What else about scratches, man? You can really repair those types of things, no, dents and scratches, because it will interact. with the quality of your instrument. So yeah. And again, this goes to the longevity because of course, owning one, no, maybe it's cheap or as expensive as you can, will still give you those types of problems or maintenance costs in the long run, no. Whether you own a 2,000 peso violin, a 200,000 peso violin, or a 2 million peso violin, the cost to own it is still there. No? I- I've seen like people get repairs for their violins that go over 20,000 pesos, no, just because something bad happened. So sometimes it's better to buy another. So maybe the hack I could teach you if you own a cheaper instrument is don't treat it with so much love. By the way, like if ever something happens to it, the repair costs would would cost more than the value of your instrument. So, with a heavy heart, it's better to buy a new one. There will come a time that you don't need to buy a new one once your instrument breaks down if your maintenance costs are more is cheaper than the repair cost, or even if the value of your instrument is cheaper than the repairs. That's the time when you get it repaired. But if you have a factory made violin that's like 2,500 pesos and you break it, there's something wrong with it. Even the bows, no? A lot of my students would ask me, "Sir, my bow is broken. What should I do? Should I get it repaired?" I would tell them, "Buy a bow that may cost more, but at least you can have it repaired." Like if your bow costs like around 700 pesos and just to have it repaired would be 1,500, that's like double the price of your bow. Why get it repaired? Why get it repaired? Just buy a new one. So you'll get to a price point where the repairs won't would matter, no? If the repairs would cost less than your instrument. Because at 2,000 pesos, for example, I can buy a set of strings for 2,000 pesos. So, you know, uh the quality of your instrument will still matter. I mean, if you put 2,000 peso strings on a 2,000 peso violin, it would change the sound that it would produce, but it won't change much. So those are the things you have to also consider. So if you want to go into it, get into the instrument, buy a cheap one first, and then see if you can maintain the costs, after lessons and stuff like that. And yeah, this is just sort of not really a warning, but sort of education to people that okay, the violin is not you might buy a cheap instrument, but your expenses won't end there. So you would still need to pay the cost of owning such a wonderful instrument. Yeah. Yeah. So that's why you don't see a lot of orchestras around. String orchestras for that matter. Because maintaining a group and maintaining the instruments are quite hard, no? You can just leave it around. Like for example, if a trumpet is left for like a month with no one using it, the valves may be a little bit hard, but with just a couple of spritz of like valve oil and a little bit of TLC, it would work out. But if a violin is left within a month, you might see when you open it up that your strings are broken, your bridges fell, and then the sound post might be affected. So you need to get it somewhere, get it fixed. That's why you always have to check, no? I mean, for me, I own two violins right now, and it's hard to maintain. Yeah, I constantly need to check each one, and it's quite hard to actually check. And then to buy strings for two. So what I do, if you have like two or three or more instruments, I buy a nice fresh set every time for one, my main violin, And then whatever comes out of my main violin, I put it on my other instrument. So I'm taking care of one. I'm giving seconds to my second violin because I can't let it go. No, why? Because if I send this one, my main violin, to repairs, I need another instrument for me to practice on. So, yeah, it's hard, but it's really fulfilling if you really want to be part of the community. If you really want to learn the instrument, no? The cost upfront is low for me than the fulfillment I get when I play the instrument. And that would end our podcast. Again, check it out on Friday, live on Anchor. Thank you for tuning in. If you have a lot of questions, just comment down below. Thank you for supporting my YouTube channel. Follow me on all my socials: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Anchor FM for podcasts, Sessions Live. Catch me on Sessions Live, of course. Check out my course on Udemy if you want to learn the instrument. And I will see you on the next one.